12. Trust as an emotional contract. Trust is often treated as a virtue in organizations, something aspirational, something reassuring, something spoken about during leadership retreats or offsites. But in global organizations, trust is not an abstract value or a motivational theme. Trust is a working contract. It is the emotional infrastructure that stabilizes communication, alignment, and behavior. When trust is strong, communication flows evenly, interpretations remain steady, and meaning travels with less distortion. When trust is fragile, every message becomes emotionally heavier, every silence becomes ambiguous, and every request becomes vulnerable to misreading. Trust is not built through logic, it is built through emotional consistency. And consistency is precisely what becomes difficult in global organizations where tone, urgency, hierarchy, and cultural instinct vary widely. People do not trust leaders because their messages are correct. They trust leaders because their emotional signals are predictable. A senior global manager once said to me, "I realized my team didn't need me to be positive. They needed me to be consistent." At first glance, this sounds simple. But in multicultural environments, consistency is more complex than most leaders assume. The same tone does not sound the same everywhere. The same behavior does not feel the same everywhere. The same message does not land the same everywhere. Consistency is contextual, and context is shaped by emotion, culture, and history. Trust grows when people experience leadership in a way that feels emotionally stable. Not perfectly stable, human beings do not need perfection. They need predictability. They need to know what leadership tone means, what urgency implies, what silence indicates, what escalation will trigger, and how decisions are made under pressure. Trust is built when these signals align with what people expect emotionally. A global team I once observed revealed this dynamic in a striking way. Their leader was universally respected for competence. But trust levels differed dramatically between regions. Some felt deeply safe with him, others hesitated. When we explored this difference, we discovered that trust was tied not to his expertise, but to how his emotional signals were interpreted. In one region, his direct style was seen as reassuring clarity. In another, the same directness felt abrupt. In another, it felt energizing. In yet another, it felt intimidating. The leader had not changed, the emotional interpretation had. This is the nature of trust in multicultural systems. It is not granted evenly. It is not formed globally. It is formed locally, emotionally, through countless interpretive encounters. Trust becomes a mosaic, not a monolith. One of the most revealing expressions of trust is how freely teams ask questions. In high-trust environments, questions flow easily because people believe questions will be welcomed, not judged. In low-trust environments, questions disappear. Silence becomes the safer choice. Leaders often misinterpret this silence, believing it signals agreement or focus. But silence is frequently a sign that trust has not yet settled enough for teams to risk vulnerability. A Latin American team once explained to me their hesitation to ask questions after global leadership briefings. "We trust the leadership's expertise," one said, "but we don't trust how our questions will be interpreted." The distinction was profound. They trusted the leader's competence, but they did not yet trust the emotional safety of the interaction. Competence and trust are not the same. Competence can be admired from a distance. Trust requires emotional proximity. In other regions, trust faltered because of perceived changes in leadership behavior. A single shift in tone, often due to workload, stress, or time pressure, led teams to reinterpret leadership messages as signs of dissatisfaction or instability. When leaders underestimate how sensitively their tone is watched, they underestimate one of the most fundamental mechanisms of trust. Trust is emotional coherence. It is built through patterns, not promises. One global CEO described her learning curve with trust during an acquisition. She believed transparency would build trust, and she communicated openly throughout the transition. But trust still varied across regions. Some felt reassured, others felt unsettled by the transparency itself. In cultures where leaders traditionally shield teams from uncertainty, transparency felt like a warning. In cultures where openness is normal, Transparency felt natural. The message was the same, the emotional interpretation was not. Trust is never built simply by being transparent. It is built when transparency aligns with emotional expectation. In multicultural organizations, trust is also shaped by hierarchy. In some cultures, trust is built through familiarity and relational warmth. In others, trust is built through competence and distance. A leader who tries to build trust through warmth may unintentionally undermine trust in a culture that associates warmth with lack of seriousness. A leader who maintains formality may inadvertently appear unapproachable in cultures that value relational closeness. Trust rests in the emotional logic of the listener, not the intention of the leader. Organizational memory, explored in the previous chapter, also plays a powerful role in trust. Teams who lived through past instability often carry emotional residue that shapes their trust in the present. Leaders may believe they are building trust from a neutral starting point. In reality, they are building trust on top of inherited emotional layers. Trust becomes the process of rewriting not only present expectations but past experiences. One senior European leader said something that captures this perfectly. "I discovered that trust is not a message you send, it's a feeling you maintain." To maintain trust, leaders must recognize that trust is not only about what they do, but how predictably they do it. It is about tone, stability, responsiveness, and emotional clarity. It is about the absence of surprises in how leaders communicate. It is about removing the emotional volatility that makes interpretation unstable. Trust acts as a buffer against drift. When trust is strong, tone is less likely to be misinterpreted. Urgency is less likely to be distorted. Escalation is less likely to become unstable. Silence is less likely to become fearful. Behavior is less likely to diverge. Trust stabilizes the emotional system that communication depends on. This is why trust is not a soft concept in global organizations. Trust is operational. Trust is strategic. Trust is structural. Trust is the emotional contract that determines how meaning travels. The next chapter explores how alignment is rebuilt not through rules or instructions, but through leadership presence, emotional precision, and the intentional stabilization of meaning across borders. If trust is the emotional contract, alignment is the emotional outcome.